the big picture into what I would call race wars or racial wars around the world, in fact, maybe with the USA in particular as its epicenter, is what we're going to focus on today. And my guest is Dr. Somadoda Fikeni. He's, I would say, South Africa's leading political analyst. And he plays in that space, and his words, well, certainly many of us hang on to every word that he does say. So, good talking to you. Thanks for giving of your time.
Thank you, Ashraf, for inviting me, and greetings to your viewers
Thank you.
and
Now,
your followers.
you clearly you have a life beyond just being the political scientist or political analyst. Very, very quickly, so that we understand it, where are you based, and what is it that you do?
I do so many things, but I'll just highlight the fact that I'm with the University of South Africa, which is the largest university in Africa and the Southern Hemisphere. It's a distance learning institution. In there, I'm the director of special projects, but also the advisor of the principal and the vice chancellor at the university. And in my other life, I'm the convener of the Indlulamity South Africa Scenarios 2030, which is looking at the future trends as to what is
Okay. Now
unfolding.
let's pick up on a trend which is beyond 2 weeks, but certainly there's one thing that has even temporarily knocked COVID-19 off of headline news around the world. It's been the race or racially defined wars, if not literally, then figuratively, coming out of the USA. Would you define it firstly as racial wars? With George Floyd, hashtag I can't breathe, as very much the center of that?
I would define it as a very long lasting pandemic that has afflicted human beings for centuries, which we have ignored at times, and it always flare up from time to time. It has found manifestations in form of slavery, in form of colonialism, and in form of a special kind of colonialism, which is apartheid, and in many other forms where identity politics has been quite prominent. And that in itself is a pandemic that has outlasted all other
Why
pandemics.
do you think that's happened? We look through civilization through the centuries. Has it always been the case, or not?
It is because of how the global system got arranged a few centuries ago, where colonization needed some labor force in other parts of the world, for example. And that labor force was through slavery, the transatlantic slave being one of the most prominent of these, in order to build up a new colony or many colonies. And that in itself, over time, evolved into legislations, institutionalization, and the ordering of things globally. Even when formally certain policies such as ending slavery or even ending discrimination was over, the system, the architecture which produced racism was left intact. And that is the reason why we're still confronted with this particular challenge today, because the formal sense of racism ended, but the psychology, the education, the reproduction of this, and the social injustice, as well as the emotional debt out of these centuries of racism, have always reproduced themselves. They mutate into more modern forms.
What then is your definition of racism?
Racism, it's when you use racial identity as the basis of discriminating against other people or oppressing them or excluding them. And that in itself is racism. It can occur as a system which is designed to discriminate a group of people, or it may manifest itself on individual conduct basis.
And the system, a good example of that would be apartheid, isn't it?
Apartheid was one well organized, institutionalized racism which was legislated and the government promoted it, and life was organized accordingly. And it was not subtle at all. Research, as well as various institutions' distribution of wealth and resources, was accordingly arranged according to race. Even public spaces were defined according to race, who goes to which part of the country, who access any ocean or sea in what point, and going to the toilets, going to the public transport. So, apartheid is one such example and a variant of racial
And
systems.
the difference, therefore, between institutionalized racism, as in apartheid, and the one-on-one interpersonal form of racism, how do you see that play out differently?
The institutionalized one would simply be the one which operate, whether legislated or it's already embedded in the systems of how things are. For example, the issue of policing, which has now been triggered in the USA. The system is designed to profile blacks as either criminals who have yet to commit a crime or are in the process of committing a crime or have committed a crime, whether innocent or not, you are already guilty, and it is up to you to prove yourself innocent. So it sort of define people, profile them. It is reproduced in the media. It is reproduced in the dinner tables that whatever wrong that happens, these are the people who will have committed it. So everyone is declared guilty. So that's the systemic expression of that. Even when now police are trying to look for criminals, they are in essence looking for blacks. And some of the blacks, as you know, have been sentenced for killing people. Even when the real killers come to confess, they are kept in prisons for decades because the system just believes that blacks fit the profile of a criminal. Then, at another level, it's declaring the people as subhuman, therefore not deserving of a treatment of any equal rights or equality before the law. So that is another level of systemic, racism. It could be access to bank credit. It could be access to many other opportunities. So it presents itself in terms of unequal treatment of people, even if they are in the same situation. But now you may have situations where individuals within those systems do express or manifest racism in their interaction on individual basis. Therefore, it is equally possible that you will have a white person, for example, who has transcended racism and can relate to you as a good neighbor or as a spouse or anything. And that particular person is not being racist to you, but the system itself could be racist. So that in itself, just like you can go into a country where you may not have systemic racism, but any individual racist could walk in there using the prism of their own prejudice. And that is where the difference
Okay,
is.
help us then understand what has happened in the USA with specifically the killing of George Floyd. In a normal situation, he would be an alleged alleged criminal in a normal situation, right? But so much more has happened. Help us understand, according to you, what has really happened.
Sometimes in human history, certain things in a very strange way coincide to produce iconic moments like the one of George Floyd that we've seen. The first one is many years when you have had such killings year in, year out, where there is a flare up and it goes away. But this time around, it happened at the time of citizen journalism when everybody is armed with a smartphone. And it happened at the time of digital mass communication of your social media, where you could actually send this thing into millions of people in a split second. So that's the first thing where you had this high resolution video and picture of a person being killed live, which others may not have the same benefits. The second one are the words the person uttered, because in other instances we knew that somebody was shot and so forth. Here you heard somebody saying, I can't breathe, I'm going to die. In essence, a person was broadcasting live his own death at the hands of the police. And you had four or so police on top of him. He was handcuffed, so there was no way of saying this person was threatening the police. The third thing was the calling of his mother, which it turns out that the mother was no longer alive, died a few years ago. And the fourth one, which we should understand as the sociological context as well as the political context, it's when you have a president in the United States who seem in all forms to have condoned and of which had hibernated. And therefore, he is the face of this institutionalized racism. And this happens in a year of election campaign when emotions are raw. And the next one is the fact that even COVID-19 pandemic has affected and afflicted African Americans more than it has affected other people. The unemployment rate that has actually jumped into almost 40 million has affected the same group. So combine all those things into a compression chamber of this experience. It gave to them, and they have been in a lockdown, they have been confined in their rooms, and all of a sudden you have this burst of energy at the time when even the global system is collapsing because it has failed to deliver on equal opportunity. It has exacerbated inequality. It has, through migration and refugee crisis, elevated identity politics. So you do have a toxic mix globally and in the US of these particular experiences which converge into that moment of George Floyd, and it is broadcast throughout the world. And I would add the last thing is US has been on the forefront of putting at the back foot countries such as China in terms of their human rights record in Hong Kong, countries such as Russia in terms of how they manage the protesters. So it was also their turn to amplify the message and demonstrate the kind of effect or even hypocrisy around this. So there are many things that combined to produce what I call the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd moment in the world.
So help us understand this, because I just want to get clarity on this. If apartheid was institutionalized racism in practice, and democratic South Africa is not, because it's post-apartheid, then why would you describe the USA as practicing institutionalized racism versus a cop or cops who are outrightly racist in their own personal behavior?
Well, institutionalized racism outlive the legislation because it remains in the minds of people, it remains in the systems, the infrastructure that reproduces racist, discriminatory continues many years after the Jim Crow laws have been removed. Many years even after slavery has been removed, because these are learned behaviors and the systems, the institutions reproduce this kind of behavior over the years. So it is not easy to simply say on the 27th of April 1994, we are declaring apartheid over, because apartheid will have created a certain category of social classes which coincide with race, just like in the US. It will have created a certain kind of training. In other words, to put it easy, the practices that exist during the time when slavery or apartheid is a situation which Samuel Johnson often says chains of habit are too weak to be felt until they are too strong to be broken. So it is the refusal of these countries and others to examine what constituted racism over the years in order to repair the damage, in order to allow for the atonement, in order to liberate those whites from the false sense of superiority and entitlements and privileges, and liberate the former oppressed from the false sense of inferiority as well as from their guilt burden, or in not guilt burden, rather the emotional debt over the years. Take one simple example. When Reverend Al Sharpton was speaking last night during the funeral of George Floyd, he says, people say, let's move on. But I'm still carrying the surname of the family that bought my great grandparents as slaves. I'm still having to confront the names, the statues, and the public spaces which are defined, venerating or even celebrating these figures. So, those are some of the issues which produce institutional culture that produce the inequalities of opportunity, the profiling of certain people, and so forth.
So you've alluded to Black Lives Matter. There's been, I think there was Blackout Tuesday as well, like a week back, and many others. But in their own form, these movements around the world, in fact, have one thing in common. Their extreme unhappiness, specifically with what happened to George Floyd, their extreme disgust with continuous racist behavior around the world, and they're hell bent on putting an end to it. My question to you is, will they succeed? Will the numbers of peoples in the capitals of the world coming out in their thousands, will that be enough to change systemic racism in many other capitals of the world?
It is a moment of reckoning which I think may give an impetus to a long drawn, protracted struggle. Remember, it was created one incident, but crucially is how these movements organize themselves and sustain the pressure and have would be in place. For example, what should be the fate of statues across the world, their names across the world, in a manner that begin to address this issue instead of waiting for another incident? What should be the new policies in terms of policing, and they become gold standards across the world for any peer review among countries? Those are the kinds of things, but it doesn't stop there. The education system that we have, the literature that we have, which very often was designed as a pan European, pan Western literature, it doesn't expose the contribution of Africans, of Indians, of Chinese, of several other groupings of Native Americans to human civilization. It simply ascribes everything to Europe, to the West. A tea that is planted in Sri Lanka suddenly is part of English breakfast, which doesn't plant a single leaf. And there's no history behind that. Maize that comes from Native Americans, there is no history to it to say where it comes from, coffee, cocoa, and so forth. Those are the kinds of things we ought to be talking about, but not only that, repatriation of some of the archives and the treasures of countries which were looted. Because, in essence, the world is a crime scene. It's built on falsehood, it's built on theft of treasures of people, and it's built on lies. If then we are to change that system, we must have an honest, difficult conversation. Of course, we can't reverse everything that ever happened, but at the same time, we cannot celebrate, as Malcolm X once said, and say we are healing when a knife that has been plunged on the body, when you remove it halfway, you can't celebrate and say, let's meet each other halfway because I've done so much. You must remove the knife and work towards the healing of the wound. Then that is reconciliation. But for as long as we don't get into those spaces and people just feel fed up, they say, let's move on. You move on having covered the wound, and each time George Floyd is killed, that wound is scratched and that wound start bleeding again.
What do you feel about the response then from the world leaders? You alluded to Donald Trump earlier on, but not just him. The USA, South Africa, the UK, Canada, France, and I probably left out another 50 other countries. What do you make of the response from these world leaders?
To me, I do appreciate the solidarity that they've shown, but the one that I take out was the Canadian one. When they were asking the Canadian leader, Trudeau, uh, about what is happening in the US, he used the opportunistic, expected, reflex response to attack the US. He said, I'm not going to address what is happening and what is regrettable in the US. We have racism here in Canada. We should work towards correcting what is here in Canada. So it is the soul searching moment for each country. And once they've done that, they can then elevate that into multinational bodies such as the UN, the AU, the EU, the whatever, and have the same kind of charter for human rights that we saw after the Second World War, so that there's something specific that speaks to racism, because it looks like it is a brand of human rights violation, a brand of identity politics that is refusing to go away. And each country has its own
So,
historical burden. If it's South Africa and racism, if it's India, the caste systems, if it's China, we're seeing some kind of racism there as well. If it's Rohingya, you have to deal with those and say, each country must come with a blueprint of dealing with its own discrimination or racism or any kind of discrimination that is mainly very often associated with the
So that's an
pigmentation
interesting
or the
point,
color of
which
people.
means, I mean, you could get two people of a similar ethnic group, right? But with slight differences, maybe sometimes religious differences, maybe not. Um, and if one grouping is discriminated against, I'm just thinking about what happened in Rwanda. We don't often call it out as racism. We may call it tribalism. You're saying, and in fact, it is still in essence racism.
It is a variation of racism because remember that the colonial system tried to construct identity politics out of those groupings which had lived together for years. And they tried to extract to say these ones are taller, these ones are like this, all this, antiquated anthropological studies that seek to look for differences than commonalities. And they went further to then give others opportunities which they were not giving to the others. They went on to give education and many other things. And they went on to reproduce this notion that your physique is coinciding with your cultural experiences and hence the racism that you saw. So we ought to give it
What do you
exactly
make
that
of the
name.
response, not just now, but over the last 50, 60, 70 years of the United Nations? I mean, we had the League of Nations, then the UN, which really purports to lead the whole world. I'm suggesting the fact that we're even having this discussion right now suggests that the UN's not really playing its role as the parent of its children, representing all those countries around the world.
Remember that if you are a pensioner parent with billionaire children, they can tell you what not to do. That is the dilemma of the UN. It has as its host the USA, it has in its Security Council mainly your European and Western countries. Therefore, it cannot touch a subject with boldness if the main members are guilty of that same crime. So UN is as strong as its strongest link and it is as weak as its weakest link. And the membership of any multinational organizations depend on those countries committing, but also on the leaders being bold, audacious, and committed to a vision. But if that is not forthcoming, or if the countries themselves are still dealing with their guilt, they can't consistently deal even with issues of reparations or repatriations and so forth, because the entire system, it's an edifice which is built on racism. Whether you talk trade systems, you talk wealth distribution, you talk many other things, it is built on the infrastructure of
Let's bring it back
institutionalized
home. I
racism.
found with great interest the in South Africa, the ruling party, the African National Congress statement in support of Black Lives Matter. Now, the South African situation is interesting because you have a democratic country now replacing an apartheid system, and the democratic country is being led by a majority black government and representing black aspirations. And the flip side of that is that in 26 years, when this government has had the opportunity to redress many of the imbalances of apartheid, there's a sense that the same grouping that they support in terms of Black Lives Do Matter, in practical expression, they've done very little to change the lives of a majority. They have changed the lives of minorities within that black grouping, which means selected groupings, say, under BEE. Your thoughts on that?
Well, to me, I do have a lot more nuanced approach to that. In the first instance, do we have any country that had institutionalized racism? especially a settler colonial special kind of colonialism in South Africa, that has ever solved racism in 26 years. None. Not anywhere in the world. And the second one, it's a misnomer that if you are a majority, that translates into power. You could be a majority, as was the case in many colonies, where if you take the colonies across Africa, across Asia, just a tiny minority had the tools to oppress the majority, produced a hegemonic system to reproduce their dominance, even though they were numerically small. So the numeric majority does not translate into power. You could be in government, but you may not be in power. You could be in a position of authority, but other factors in a hegemonic system already confine you into a particular action or non action. And the third one, power exists in the economy, in the political sphere, in the social sphere. What we saw in 1994 was partially the handover of political power, but the economic power, the social power, is still in the hands of the people who were dominant in the past. It is that reason that today we're speaking their language, we're wearing their clothes, we eating the food, we confine to what they say is best practice for ABCDE. And they are also a link to the global hegemonic system which says what is wrong, what is right. They are linked into that particular system. So whatever government efforts were there, yes, they have many things to account for and the weaknesses for not being bold in their movement. But it is not as if there was no resistance. Remember, up to this day, any little movement they make, they are taken to by people who are moneyed. And if in South Africa you have money, you can keep justice at bay. So that is the whole power structure. As to who gets voted and is voted out is not in social science terms translating into power. You know that at times people behind the scenes, when they are under pressure to put this vice chancellor who is black in an institution whose institutional culture is still dominantly white, that person has very little power because the system is structured in a manner that defines what they can or they cannot do. Should they go beyond that, they're out. Obama was the president of the US. Did it mean that blacks now had some influence disproportionate to their numbers or anything? Nothing. He was moving into a caste and an institution. He could tinker with the edges of the system. So to me, the most fundamental issue today is who has economic power, who has the social power to define the norms, the values, the everything. That is hegemonic power. So when you are lodging a counter hegemonic strategy, struggle, you ought to understand that. That is the reason why you find in other countries where you have an overwhelming majority, but just a tiny minority of people continue to exercise influence, hegemony, without even showing up in any annual report, but
So, do
behind the
I then
scenes, they
say,
have
if
the
I understand
influence.
you correctly, that in South Africa, we've eliminated institutionalized apartheid? We still have social injustice based upon skin color, historical, and we still have economic injustice, and therefore we haven't truly eliminated apartheid. And if you say yes to that, my next question to you would be, what should then be happening next?
In fact, we have not even removed the institutionalized racism. We removed the formal legal framework of apartheid. But institutionalized racism can actually exist even when the laws have moved the other way. On paper, for example, we spoke about the USA. On paper, it says all men are created equal. but in practice, the system does the opposite. Similarly, in South Africa, it would say we have this equality. In any event, you express racial equality in essence when you celebrate the victory of Springboks at the airport. But when you have to go home, some have to take PRASA trains and taxis into informal settlements. Some may not even make it to their homes, they'll be mugged and robbed. Whereas others will take Gautrain and take an Uber home. Already, that kind of coincidence of race built over the years and class recreates forms of racism because people then will start saying it means we Europeans were cleverer. That's why we have more, and whatever they are doing, they'll always end up with less. Without telling the story as to why people arrive there. So you have a systemic racism. So, what should happen? First, we must have a difficult conversation as a nation on the persistence of the legacy of apartheid and colonialism so that we understand the source and the roots of this. And that conversation leads to deep reconscientization, not just awareness. Awareness, it's what you can open Google and just understand, oh, there was apartheid this year, something happened, but a deep immersion where we begin to appreciate and associate certain things historically and how they are linked to our lives today, so that you can understand the privileges that have been bequeathed to certain groups of people and opportunities denied to others. That's the psychological aspect of education. The media, the socializing agents such as schools, the churches, families have to deal with that aspect as well in giving a new paradigm, a new perspective for understanding this. The second one, there is social justice. How this discrimination led to people having different lives and material base. Hence, the issue of land, the issue of wealth ownership, the issue of affirmative action, the issue of a restoration of certain things that were lost to people. That in itself deals with the material base. Then you do have the social. For example, the issue of linguistic narrative justice. People are struggling to express themselves in this democracy, public discourse, because they can only do that in English. The forms they have to fill are in English. Even the warnings about the dangers in their workspaces where they are majority black people with their indigenous languages, they are in English. Even the covert discourse right now has mainly been technically in English. So that in itself denies them the voice to participate in commerce, in governance, and in just the social life generally. And that has also economic implications as well. When you say in a school, we will have Afrikaans as compulsory, you are already saying African speakers, you will be employed, you are guaranteed, because your language matters. But if you are Pedi, you are a vendor, and you are in Gauteng, that language is optional or it's not even going to,
So
it has economic benefit.
you speak about having this
So,
difficult conversation, right?
yes,
In what form, in your opinion, should this difficult conversation take?
to me, I do think that we had a political codessa in 1990s, early 1990s. It resolved the political and it provided the infrastructure, the institutions of democracy. Now, I do think that we need to have a socio-economic codessa of race and economic and social dominance are dealt with. And out of that, then we could craft a social compact. And remember, such a dialogue will not just be dealing with black and white. It will be dealing with all the byproduct of racism because it reinforced identity politics in terms of, religion, in terms of ethnicity or tribes, in terms of rural, urban, in all different permutations. So it would have to deal with those issues, including patriarchy in the context of apartheid, how it reproduced that. When a man was sent to the mines, was sent to the sugar plantations, and the family was left with women behind, and they were declared as the head of the family, that was a form of producing
Why?
patriarchy
Why?
within every other arrangement. When it produced patriarchy within the context of apartheid or colonialism. So this is a multi-layered arrangement of several forms of discrimination. As we deal with it, it will be like peeling the onion layers. It will be difficult, there'll be tears along the way, but it should also promise that in the end, what we're going to produce will be good for all of us, black and white, brown or yellow, and everybody in a system higher than what we have existed in. It offers something for our children, if not us, that which frees them from the prejudice of racism, the prejudice of identity politics, so that they ultimately see each
And why do
other
you
as
think
human and
that
nothing
this
else.
difficult conversation that we speak about, why has this not happened already 26 years into democratic South Africa? And why has it not been driven, in fact, by the ruling party that has been given a mandate to change the lives of South Africa as in a better life for all?
There's a number of factors in place. The first one, South Africans deployed certain concepts which misled us. We said we were the rainbow nation. Instead of saying we aspire to be a rainbow nation and we are not yet a rainbow nation. As a result, whoever wanted to raise alarm on the existing racism, the very racist then took the same concept and say, now you are talking race, you are destroying the notion of rainbowism. So if you have dominant groups which are guilty, they are as dangerous because they can appropriate the right language of the constitution. They can appropriate the well-meaning language such as Rainbow Nation. They appropriated Madiba. All of a sudden, Madiba now had to be defined as this hugging gentleman for reconciliation. He has never talked of transformation. He has never been involved in any armed struggle. He has always been. This is the person, the same people could not vote for him in his own ward in Houghton. But when it is convenient, they would pull him out of the box and use him. The same people who said remove Ubuntu in the preamble of the Constitution in 1993 because it is a culture of blacks. When now reconciliation was never wanting to understand its broader context. So we have deployed wrong concepts. ANC has been in government, but it has not been in power. That's why it could not do these things. Therefore, we should be asking ourselves, where is the locus of power? Where is the source of influence? Who sets the agenda? Of course, they made their own policy blunders and other blunders. For example, the issue of corruption gave a latch to some of the people who always wanted to prove that blacks cannot rule themselves. They then said it confirms why our grandparents always oppressed these people. Not knowing that we had a period in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, when SOEs were well governed and so forth before the looting took on another 10, when your Transnets, your Escoms were rated globally as some of the leading companies. So it gave them power. And of course, the issue of resistance by those who still have the means and the power have feature. Let me give you an example in the mainstream media. Mainstream media has to reflect on some of its biases. When there is corruption in the public sector, which is mainly black government officials, those people are actually followed. There is investigation. Which car are they driving? What tea are they drinking? Which schools are their kids going, and so forth? We know everything about them. Even when you have the likes of the Guptas who were close to former President Jacob Zuma, we knew the convoy of cars. We knew the place they were staying in. It became part of the lingo. When corruption involves the Steinoffs of this world, when it involves Bosasa people, you do not see anybody following them to say, what cars are they driving? Where are their children? Because we're trying to compress the confirmation that criminality is black, stealing is black. When there was corruption, alleged corruption in Bombela Stadium for the 2010 World Cup, Kaiser Motaung, Bobby Motaung's son, was in front pages. We saw his face, we saw his name. When the construction industries colluded, the word corruption and fraud was not even used. They used collusion, creative accounting, and everything else, which average person who doesn't understand English would actually think it's some technical, which has nothing to do with corruption. We didn't even see the logos of the companies, let alone the faces of people who sat in the meetings. So in this country, the dominant narrative is still driven by people who are guilty, who were involved in racism, who are still in positions of influence and power. And when they are about to be cornered, they then go to the global system, which is equally racist, because they are the local expression of that. So we are dealing with something that is both
So,
local and
two things
global.
before we wrap up then. We certainly know who had the power in the period in the apartheid world. Who then has the power now, if not the ruling party?
The ruling party has normative power of being in government, but the dominant wide power structures that were there before, who control the economy, who have deep pockets to go to the lawyers, who have research institutes to give a human face to discrimination, those are the people who have the power. And it repeats itself. Other institutions were told, but now you have a black CEO, now you have a black DG, now you have a black vice chancellor. When you look at the different mid layer structures which sustain the system, you find that the protocols of the old system are still in place, intact. You find that they define what excellence is, they define what is right and wrong. They define what is intelligent. They define what should be headline. They define what you find when you are searching Google. If Ashraf is wrong and has done something wrong, when you search for it in Google, it will always be on top. But if Gustav Steinoff has done something wrong, it has a way of disappearing. You try to Google It shows you somebody who stole some potatoes in Cambodia. The person is not appearing. So the entire infrastructure, which is not just South African, but it's also global. Remember, colonialism was a global expression. When it ended, it actually mutated into imperialism in its expression. And it is for that reason that even small things such as White Christmas, when you are in such a hot summer in the south, that a Santa, when it is 34 degrees, has to wear warm clothing of people for the clothing that was prepared for people closer to the North Poles. Those small things that we find in our midst, when the discourse today is in English and sometimes in Afrikaans, when the majority of people have their own languages, it means we've cut them out so that the few like us who are educated, who have to subscribe to the dominant expectation of what is good, what is right, what is cosmopolitan, what is good food, what is good taste of music, and so forth. So it's the whole universe of things that I think even ANC leaders have not even begun to grasp. What happened in 1994, in essence, was the political elite arrangement where some leaders of the ANC and some political leaders across the political class assimilated to the dominant system without transforming it. Yes, they went hoping to transform it. They underestimated the complexity of this particular system. Hence, they find themselves now inside it, trying to conform to it without even understanding its extent and the
So
boundaries.
let's end by putting forward this scenario. If people have been discriminated against, and in the South African scenario on the basis of race, then that's racism, and that's happened for a long time. And it's right that those people now begin to assert themselves to their rightful position. There's a sense, however, in asserting oneself as a race, and let's call it Black Pride or Black Lives Matter or organizations like the Black Management Forum, and I can use many others with the prefix black, that in effect we understand the reasons, but does it not then, in the short and in the long term, set the pathway to perpetuating racism and a different form of racism down the line?
Yes, if it is reactive to what was racism, then it surely will perpetuate that. But if it constructs a higher level ideology around human race to say, let's solve these things and aspire through a particular trajectory and pathway to move into the higher level, where it wouldn't matter to be white, it wouldn't matter to be black, it wouldn't matter to be colored Indian, Xhosa, Zulu, Venda. You will simply be human and be judged as such. But for us to do that, we cannot do it by disarming and silencing the categories, because the categories are the ones around which discrimination was arranged. So if you want to have a proper diagnosis and prescription, you must first understand those well. But it should not be on the basis of anger, of victimhood, or of revenge, or of saying we're doing exactly what they were doing, because then that is regressive. It should be on the basis of saying we are fighting a system, not a person. And a person is redeemable if the system is defeated, if the system is dismantled. And therefore, it should not lead us to a situation where we become paranoid and think that every black person is necessarily transformative or is progressive in nature, or every white person is racist, because you may have instances where a white person, enlightened, understanding of these historical circumstances, becomes a transformative figure who can liberate a lot more other people through their interventions. So it is not a matter of the pigmentation. Yes, we are discriminated accordingly because of our color, but it should not be an aspiration to say we're
And
therefore moving
therefore,
in that
in the
direction.
South African situation playing out, is it a reactive scenario, or is it progressive in terms of dismantling the impact of race?
It is a lot more complex. It has element of being reactive. You do have some people who have retreated into primordial identities where they think essentially being of a certain color is in itself self-evident of being right. That in itself, I think, or being entitled, is a regressive way. But there are certain interventions, not perfect, which say, for example, affirmative action, black empowerment, they've had their own problems. The point is not even affirmative action, but corrective action. That's what it ought to be. To say once corrected, we should envision a period when there will be no need for such policies because we will have leveled the playing field. But as long as these are not changing, and as long as those who enjoy privilege continue to resist, they prolong the life
So to
of
end
these
with,
reactive
what should,
tendencies.
what would you like to see happen in South Africa? What would you like to see happen around the world in the world's attempts to dismantle any form of racism?
I do think that we could sustain the current movement, which has been triggered by George Floyd, but elevate it into the legislatures, into national discourse, where each country says what are the peculiar tendencies of the expression of racism in our case. Have an open dialogue where you will accept conflicting tendencies and educate each other until we have the right education, conscientization, and history. But also we address the material conditions that are a manifestation of these. Once this has happened, it could even be elevated into the United Nations and other multilateral forums, just like we did with the issue of human rights, with the issues of universal suffrage, with the issues of Geneva Convention and many other things, and just make racism a global concern and a global crime where it manifests itself, whether it's in sports bodies or in trade and economy or in the media, anywhere else, have monitoring barometers to see if we're making progress in that sense. And we can even have a list of people like we do with the pedophile. If people have a history of being racist, you put them into a register so that wherever they move, Australia, South Africa,
Well, that's where
it
we will
shows
leave
who
it.
they are.
Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, thank you for giving us your time. Thanks for presenting your big picture into the issues of race and racialism and what needs to happen around what appears to be a rather ubiquitous problem all around the world. Appreciate your time.